Very happy International Yoga Day to all of you. And you know that yoga has now become almost a synonym for the Indian culture. But for the West, yoga is still limited to the asanas. Asanas is only one portion, one part of yoga. Yoga is much deeper, much profound than merely performing the physical asanas. What all yoga encapsulates, what all yoga means. Today we are very privileged that we have amongst us Swami Medhananda. Swami Medhananda is a monk of Ramakrishna mission, and he is an alumnus of Oxford University. He studied here in the year 2000, and he went on to do a PhD in philosophy from UC Berkeley, and he's been a member of Ramakrishna Order since last 13 years. Today he'll be speaking on the 4 yogas of Swami Vivekananda, and it would be you would be happy to know that this very place where we are having this program, Swami Vivekananda visited 126 years ago and met Professor Max Mueller, the great ontologist of 19th century, and they had a lunch together. The meeting is recorded in the complete works of Swami Vivekananda and in some other works also. We are so grateful to the owners of this property who have allowed us to have this event here, and we are so grateful to Swami Sarvasthananda Maharaj, Swami Tripurananji Maharaj, and Swami Medhananda, who have spared their time to address us all here at the Hindu Society of the Oxford University. Swami Medhananda.
Thank you so much to Nitish for organizing this wonderful event. And my humble pranams to revered Sarvasthananji Maharaj and revered Swami Tripurananji Maharaj. I'll start with the mantra. Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Aharine. I bow down to Swami Vivekananda, the king of yogis, the son of the bliss of discernment, who is the essence of Satchitananda and the remover of all afflictions. And I must thank also, please tell me your name. Jonathan. He's the son of the owner of this house, and he very generously agreed to let us use this venue for this very special occasion. So this day is doubly auspicious. It's International Yoga Day, and it's a wonderful time to be. It's here. It's on the in June 1896. Swami Vivekananda himself came here to visit Max Mueller, and I wanted to read to you from. This is what Swami Vivekananda himself said about this occasion. He said, "The professor, meaning Max Mueller, was kindness itself, and asked Mr. Sturdy and myself to lunch with him. He showed us several colleges in Oxford and the Bodleian Library. He also accompanied us to the railway station. And all this he did because, as he said, it is not every day one meets a disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa." And as Nitish mentioned, International Yoga Day is often known as a day for doing a lot of postural yoga. That's the academic term for, asanas is a Sanskrit term. So you'll see lots of classes where yoga means essentially doing in English things like downward dog. There's this kind of language used. But as he said, there's a much deeper significance behind yoga. And I want to discuss that deeper significance and how Swami Vivekananda understood the term yoga and its importance in spiritual life. For Swami Vivekananda, yoga means in Sanskrit yoking or connecting. So the fundamental idea behind yoga is, how do we reconnect ourselves as souls with God? We suffer because we don't feel that connection. We're already connected, but we don't feel that connection. That's our problem. So we have to attain knowledge of our natural our eternal connection with God. And one thing that's interesting is that the term religion in English, it comes from the Latin word religio, which is essentially the same as yoga because it means which means again, and religio is a word meaning connecting. You are reconnecting with God. That's what religion means fundamentally in English languages, in Western languages. And it's also what yoga means in the deeper spiritual sense in which Vivekananda uses it. So that's what I want to go into in a little bit more detail today. How did Swami Vivekananda explain the different yogas? But before I do that, because we're at Oxford, all of you know that Max Mueller was a great professor here in Oxford University. But there's a more obscure connection that I wanted to call your attention to first. It's a nice segue into the discussion that I've planned. There's a biographical fact, which is that Max Mueller desperately wanted the Bowdoin Professorship of Sanskrit, wanted that post. But it sounds like for religious reasons, because the authorities at Oxford didn't approve of some of his religious positions, they ended up giving that position to a more conservative Christian scholar named Monier Williams. Max Mueller was quite upset about that, but he recovered and he got a nice academic posting anyway at Oxford University. But more relevant to us is that Vivekananda was aware of Monier Williams, and he came across a very striking passage from a lecture that Monier Williams gave, most likely at Oxford. So I want to read to you from a letter from 1894 that he wrote to one of the Hales in the US. He wrote, 1st July, 1894, Dear Mother, here I find a quotation from a speech by Sir Monier Williams, professor of Sanskrit in the Oxford University. It is very strange as coming from one who every day expects to see the whole of India converted to Christianity. Monier Williams was a staunch kind of Christian fundamentalist, and part of his aim was to convert Hindus to Christianity. And then Swamiji continues, and this is the quotation from Monier Williams, which Swamiji finds so striking. Monier Williams says, and yet it is a remarkable characteristic of Hinduism that it neither requires nor attempts to make converts, nor is it at present by any means decreasing in numbers, nor is it being driven out of the field by two such proselytizing religions as Mohammedanism and Christianity. On the contrary, it is at present rapidly increasing. And far more remarkable than this is that it is all receptive, all embracing, and all comprehensive. It claims to be the one religion of humanity, of human nature, of the entire world. It cares not to oppose the progress of Christianity nor of any other religion, for it has no difficulty in including all other religions within its all-embracing arms and ever-widening fold. Now remember, this is Monier Williams talking, not Vivekananda, but it sounds very similar. And in real fact, Hinduism has something to offer which is suited to all minds. Its very strength lies in its infinite adaptability to the infinite diversity of human characters and human tendencies. It has its highly spiritual and abstract side suited to the philosophical higher classes. This is what Vivekananda later went on to preach as Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. Its practical and concrete side suited to the man of affairs and the man of the world. This is what Swamiji later went on to preach as Karma Yoga, the yoga of unattached action. Its aesthetic and ceremonial side suited to the man of poetic feeling and imagination. This corresponds to Swamiji's Bhakti Yoga. Its quiescent and contemplative side suited to the man of peace and lover of seclusion. This is the yoga of Raja Yoga, the yoga of concentration and meditation, which Swamiji often talked about and wrote an entire book about. Then Monier Williams concludes, indeed, the Hindus were Spinozists 2,000 years before the birth of Spinoza, Darwinians centuries before the birth of Darwin, and evolutionists centuries before the doctrine of evolution had been accepted by the Huxleys of our time, and before any word like evolution existed in any language of the world. So that's the quotation from Monier Williams. Then Swami Vivekananda says, this, as coming from one of the staunchest defenders of Christianity, is wonderful indeed. But he seems to have got the idea quite correct. It's a very striking passage. And it's possible that one factor or that led Swami Vivekananda to emphasize the four yogas in his expositions on Hinduism and on Vedanta was this, because he read this very startling passage from a Christian missionary who's intent on converting Hindus to Christianity. And he sees that, wait a minute, so even these people who are hostile to Hinduism recognize this as its main strength. So let me try to emphasize these strengths of Hinduism. That seemed to be Swamiji's thinking. So what I want to discuss briefly today, and then I'd love to hear from you. So I'm only going to speak for maybe about a half hour, and then I'd like to hear from all of you. I want to discuss Swamiji's philosophy of four yogas. And I want to explain three basic dimensions of this philosophy of four yogas. The first dimension of his philosophy of four yogas, he tries to show the rationality and the broadness of Hinduism in order to combat the misunderstandings of Christian missionaries. Remember that he was speaking in the late 19th century, and they had all sorts of weird ideas. They had ideas like that Indian women would throw their babies to the crocodiles, literally. I mean, these are some of the weird ideas that people in the West had about Hindus and Indians. And so part of his mission when he came to the West, starting in 1893, was to correct these misconceptions about Hinduism and about Hindu practices. And at the same time, because India was under British colonial rule, there were many, many Christian missionaries who were intent on converting Hindus to Christianity. And so he was also trying to show that Hinduism can stand proud against any of these other religions, these missionary religions like Islam and Christianity. And it was a great help to him to bring in this philosophy of the four yogas. So what is the relevance of the four yogas in this context? Basically, Swami Vivekananda, he emphasized that if you look at the Hindu scriptures very broadly, you'll find that these scriptures emphasize different kinds of spiritual practices. And he classified these spiritual practices into four main kinds, each of which he called a different yoga. I've already mentioned them, but I'll mention them again. And so the thing to keep in mind is in this context, when he's trying to make Hinduism appealing and rational to a broader audience, he defines the yogas within the Hindu context in a somewhat narrow manner, deliberately. He wants to show that you can find all of these yogas within the Hindu scriptures. So when he says Raja Yoga, he has a book called Raja Yoga. He associates Raja Yoga, he defines Raja Yoga in terms of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which is our main foundational scripture of yoga philosophy. And it details what's called Ashtanga Yoga. Asana, by the way, which is the physical, they're not actually physical postures. We think that asana means physical postures, but in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, asana just means Sukham Sthiram Asana, which means sit in a comfortable posture so that you can meditate on your true spiritual nature. So even that asana, the word asana in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra does not correspond to what we do in yoga classes throughout the world. That's just a small side note. But Ashtanga Yoga is in its higher reaches about meditation, sense control, renunciation, with the aim of attaining spiritual realization of our true nature as the Purusha, as an eternal soul. So Swamiji, when he talks about Raja Yoga, the yoga of concentration meditation, he has Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in mind. When he talks about Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, he tends to have in mind Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And you'll find him discussing Advaita Vedanta in his lectures on Jnana Yoga in many places. But I wanted to mention that Shankara's school is not the only school that accepts and teaches Jnana Yoga. Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta also teaches Jnana Yoga, but it's quite different from the Jnana Yoga in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. For Ramanuja, Jnana Yoga is the practice of meditating on your true nature as an eternal divine soul, separate from the body-mind complex. And he says, interestingly, he kind of turns the tables on Shankara here, because Shankara says that Bhakti Yoga is a lower practice culminating in Jnana Yoga, and then you practice Jnana Yoga, and then you attain Advaitic realization. Ramanuja says Jnana Yoga is a preliminary practice. It's a very important practice. It's an essential practice, but it's a preliminary practice culminating in Bhakti Yoga. Because the logic is, this is something that one of our very senior monks in our order in Belumat, Swami Bhajananandaji, he often emphasizes. He says, you cannot feel real bhakti for God until you have broken your identification with the body-mind complex. You have to feel yourself as a soul before you can really feel a natural love for God, because it's the soul in us that loves God. That's the Amrita Saputra. That's a child of God, not the body-mind. The body-mind is insentient. So we have to first realize ourselves as eternal souls in order to feel genuine bhakti for God. That's the basic idea behind Ramanuja's Jnana Yoga. I just wanted to flag that Jnana Yoga itself has been defined in different ways in different Hindu traditions. So that's Jnana Yoga. When Swamiji talks about Bhakti Yoga, within the Hindu context, he has in mind the many different devotional traditions within Hinduism. We know them: Vaishnavism, Shaktism, many forms of Tantra, so forth and so on. And when he talks about Karma Yoga, he's thinking of the Nishkama Karma, the doctrine of unattached action taught in the Bhagavad Gita, another one of our most important Vedantic scriptures. And so he often emphasized that Hinduism is the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion, the universal religion, precisely because it's so all-comprehensive and all-embracing, exactly in the way that Monier Williams pointed out. It prescribes different spiritual practices for different temperaments, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all religion. Each person, each Hindu can practice the path that he or she finds most suitable, most appealing to him or her. So that's the first dimension of Swamiji's philosophy of the 4 yogas. He brought in the 4 yogas to defend the rationality and the broadness and the greatness of the Hindu religion. The second dimension, starting in late 1895, he taught the harmony of all the world's religions on the basis of the 4 yogas. So the first dimension is about explaining what Hinduism is to non-Hindus and showing them that it's a rational and a profound religion. The second task is using this paradigm of the 4 yogas to explain how all of the world's religions are harmonious. How did he do this? He begins by defining the same 4 yogas in a much broader manner. Not in a specifically Hindu context, but in a much broader manner. So Raja Yoga is no longer defined in terms of Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, these kinds of practices mentioned in that particular scripture. Raja Yoga includes any spiritual practices which involve concentration or meditation or mysticism. So it's a much broader definition of Raja Yoga. And he does the same thing with the other 3 yogas. What is Jnana Yoga? The yoga of knowledge. Instead of defining it in terms of just Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, or you can say, or just Ramanuja's Vishta Advaita Vedanta, he says Jnana Yoga encompasses any spiritual practices involving the use of intellectual reasoning, what is known in Sanskrit as vichara. Karma Yoga, instead of defining Karma Yoga in terms of the particular way that Bhagavad Gita defines Karma Yoga, he says that Karma Yoga encompasses any spiritual practices involving action in the world, any kind of dynamic action, doing things in the world on a spiritual basis. And Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, he doesn't define in terms of just the Hindu devotional sects. He says any spiritual practices that involve worshiping or cultivating devotion toward the personal God count as Bhakti Yoga. So that's the first step. He redefines these 4 yogas in a much broader manner. Now, on the basis of these broader definitions of the 4 yogas, what he says is he teaches 5 main doctrines, which he claims forms the core of what he calls Vedanta, which is basically synonymous with Hinduism. The first doctrine, and he learned all of these doctrines from his guru Sri Ramakrishna. There's one infinite divine reality, which has many forms and aspects. That same divine reality, some people perceive or call God, others as Allah, some as Christ, others as Krishna, Shiva, Kali, Brahman, and so on. He says this in a lecture. He says the grand principle of Vedanta is that there is that one in whom this whole universe of matter and mind finds its unity, known as God or Brahman or Allah or Jehovah or any other name. That's the first principle of Vedanta. Second, the goal of life is to realize this infinite divine reality in any form or aspect. It doesn't matter which, whatever you prefer. The third basic principle of Vedanta Each of the 4 yogas is a direct and independent path to the goal of God realization. You can take any of these 4 yogas, you can practice it, and if you're a sincere practitioner, you will reach the same goal of God realization. Where does he say this? For instance, in Raja Yoga, he says, each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal. Do this either by work, karma yoga, or worship, bhakti yoga, or psychic control, raja yoga, or philosophy, jnana yoga. And notice again how broad these terms are. Work, worship, psychic control, and philosophy. These are very broad definitions of the yogas, which are not specifically Hindu, right? By one or more or all of these and be free. This is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. And similarly, in a class on karma yoga he delivered on 3rd January 1896, he says, each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, of wisdom, and of devotion are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. So he's not saying that one yoga is higher than the others or more advanced than the others. He's saying they're all equally equipped to bring us to the highest goal of God realization. One thing that a lot of us are, it depends on where we were raised and how our parents raised us and what we were taught, but a lot of us take these things for granted. But we need to appreciate how radical these ideas were at the time that Swamiji was teaching them in the late 1890s, especially in the Vedantic context, because all of the traditional Vedantic schools, they had a hierarchy of yogas, and they would always say that one yoga is higher than the other yogas. Shankaracharya's school of Advaita Vedanta would say that Jnana Yoga is the highest yoga. Only that can take you directly to the goal of liberation. Ramanuja and other followers of Bhakti schools of Vedanta, on the other hand, turned the tables and said that Bhakti Yoga is the highest yoga, and Jnana Yoga is a preparatory discipline. And those games have gone on for centuries. They're still going on. Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda came along and they preached to the entire world that each one of these yogas is on an equal footing. So that's a very important idea to understand. This is a radical idea at the time that he was teaching this. And remember that the other way that he was quite radical is in redefining these 4 yogas in a much broader manner to make them not just Hindu yogas, but universal yogas. So that's the 3rd principle. Now the 4th principle of Vedanta, and this is where we come to how does he ultimately arrive at the harmony of all religions on the basis of the 4 yogas. 4th principle, every one of the world's religions corresponds to one or more of these 4 yogas. He says, for instance, in his lecture on Sri Ramakrishna, a man may be intellectual or devotional or mystic or active. The various religions represent one or the other of these types. So that's the 4th principle. Every one of the religions, Christianity corresponds, you can say, to Bhakti Yoga and to some extent to Karma Yoga, because they are, depending on which sect of Christianity, but they often emphasize serving others in a spirit of compassion. Islam, you can say something similar, Bhakti Yoga. So Buddhism might be more Jnana Yoga oriented. More meditative, mystical traditions can be aligned with Raja Yoga, right? So he says every single one of these world religions corresponds to one or more of the 4 yogas. Now, combine all of those 4 principles and you end up with a very, very profound and important conclusion. Every world religion is equally capable of taking us to salvation, right? That's the beauty of it. So look at how elegantly he arrives at the harmony of all religions on the basis of a philosophy of 4 yogas. This is what is known in contemporary philosophy and theology as religious pluralism, the view that multiple religions are equally effective in taking us to the goal of salvation. So Swami Vivekananda defended this view many decades before Western philosophers like John Hick, who started defending this doctrine in the 1970s. And even now, you'll find that many religions don't accept religious pluralism. They accept what's called religious inclusivism at best. So for instance, in the 1960s, the Catholic Pope at the time wrote a work in Latin called Nostra Aetate, where he changed the official position of the Catholic Church from exclusivism, which is a view that only the Catholic religion will lead to salvation and no other religious path will lead to salvation, to the inclusivist view that the Catholic religion is the highest religion, it's the best religion, but other religions may reflect a ray of that same sun of truth. So he's willing to grant some validity to other non-Catholic religious paths, but he's not putting the other religious paths on an equal footing with Catholicism. So that's what, it's not a religious pluralism, but it's a religious inclusivism. And we find that also in Indian traditions, like some understandings of Advaita Vedanta is that Advaita Vedanta is the highest philosophy. Other religions are not wrong, but they're lower stages on the way to the highest stage of Advaita Vedanta. So I would call that inclusivism rather than pluralism. Now, I've explained the first two dimensions of his philosophy of the four yogas, and I wanted to end by talking about a third dimension, which is also very important, but it's often missed. From the standpoint of individual spiritual practice, sadhana, Swamiji argues that it is best to try to combine all four yogas to the best of our ability. It's true that any one of these yogas can take us to the highest goal of salvation. Nonetheless, he felt it was very important for people to try to combine all four yogas. The emblem of the Ramakrishna mission, which Swamiji himself sketched, embodies this harmony of the four yogas. There's a serpent, which represents Raja Yoga, and there are the wavy waters of the ocean. Swamiji himself explained the emblem. So he said the wavy waters of the ocean represents Karma Yoga. There's a lotus, which represents Bhakti Yoga. And there's a swan, which represents our divine soul. And then there's a sun, which represents Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. And so the ideal of every spiritual practitioner in our tradition is to combine all four of these yogas to the best of our ability. But what's his reasoning? What's his logic for this combination? He says this in one of his lectures: would to God that all men were so constituted that in their minds, all these elements of philosophy, Jnana Yoga, mysticism, Raja Yoga, emotion, Bhakti Yoga, and of work, Karma Yoga, were equally present in full. That is the ideal, my ideal of a perfect man. Everyone who has only one or two of these elements of character, I consider one-sided. And this world is almost full of such one-sided men with knowledge of that one road only in which they move. And anything else is dangerous and horrible to them. To become harmoniously balanced in all these four directions is my ideal of religion. So this is a very important statement. Swamiji is claiming that even if if one yoga can take us to the highest goal, it's still better for us, even as spiritual aspirants, to try to combine the yogas. The reason is that each one of these yogas cultivates a different aspect of the human personality. So Jnana Yoga cultivates the intellect, Bhakti Yoga, the heart, the emotions, Karma Yoga, the dynamic side of our nature, what's often called will by Western philosophers, and Raja Yoga, the mystical and meditative, concentrative side of our nature, right? So why not use all of the resources of the human personality? So the idea is, when we're able to combine the four yogas, we can tap into all the different aspects of the human personality and make more rapid spiritual progress. But we also become broader and we become less fanatical. That's another implication of what he's saying here. So I think that on the basis of these claims, and especially this last thing, which is this last doctrine, which is that we shouldn't rest content with just practicing one yoga, but we should try to combine all four of the yogas. Remember, again, one of his core principles is that each of the world religions corresponds to one or more of these yogas, which means that one of the ways that we can combine all of these four yogas is to learn from religions other than our own. We can take notes on Bhakti Yoga from reading the Christian scriptures, the Bible, from going to church and speaking to sincere Christian spiritual aspirants. We can learn about other aspects of Bhakti Yoga by reading the Quran and by speaking to sincere spiritual practitioners in their tradition, and so forth and so on with respect to all the different world religions. We can learn more about Jnana Yoga by learning about Buddhist mindfulness, for instance. Mindfulness has become a very popular topic especially in the West. And it's perfectly legitimate, Swamiji says, to incorporate different aspects of other religions into your own religious practice. And he says this, actually. I wanted to read this. This is an important passage. He says, I accept all religions that were in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship him. I shall go to the mosque of the Mohammedan. I shall enter the Christian's church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhistic temple where I shall take refuge in Buddha and in his law. I shall go into the forest and sit down in meditation with the Hindu who is trying to see the light which enlightens the heart of everyone. And I don't see this as a metaphor or exaggeration. I think he himself went into different Christian churches and other, religious institutions, and he's encouraging us to do it as well. But it's important not to get misled by that and to think that he's saying that we should just randomly practice a bunch of religions. That becomes, there's a dish in India called khichdi, which is a mixture, a hodgepodge of different ingredients. We don't want our religious life to just become a hodgepodge like that. The idea is that remain firmly anchored in your own religious tradition, understand it clearly, and then on that basis, you can freely practice and learn from other religions. That seems to be the idea. And I wanted to end by mentioning another important point that Swamiji makes. He says that no man is born to any religion. He has a religion in his own soul. This is also very important. We think of religion as Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, but Swamiji is making a much more profound point here. Each one of us has a unique religion in the depths of our soul. And so the first step in spiritual life is to discover that unique religion that's best suited for our nature. And again, the greatest help in doing that is to expose ourselves to a multiplicity of religions. And then we can actually learn from and we can try to incorporate different religious practices into our own practice with the aim of discovering what that unique custom-made religion is that's there in our soul. Thank you. And I'd love to hear from you now. Yes, please.
Of the 4 years very well. I suppose any one path will take it.
Yeah. One-sided is the word. Yeah.
So it's not rounded enough.
Yeah, right.
Very confusing, the two statements. If one is going to take, so the angular man can also go there.
Yeah.
Why should you say that angular man who can go straight there also needs the 4?
He doesn't need the 4. He doesn't have to. And in fact, I think what he says is that most people prefer to be one-sided. So it's not that, but the idea is that if you practice multiple yogas, the mind expands and you become less fanatical about your particular standpoint, which is important because of, the fact of religious violence, which was present in his time, but it's equally present now, unfortunately. So there's also a kind of social dimension to these ideas, Why is it that even though somebody practicing only his or her narrow religious path, even though that can take him or her to the highest goal, why should he or she still be open to other religious paths and other yogas? The idea is because there's so much violence and killing in the name of religion, and he knew that, and it's a very unfortunate fact, right? So I think that there's a kind of social thrust and a humanitarian, compassionate thrust behind that teaching. Why we should combine the 4 yogas? It's an excellent question. It seems like a direct contradiction in some way.
So contradictory.
Yeah.
It was not gelling in my
Yeah.
If I can go the straight path, why do I have to incorporate the others?
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question.
Please, but tell me your name first.
I'm Nayantara, and basically, like Advaita says, like it places the Jnana Yoga a higher pedestal than Bhakti Yoga. How did Ramakrishna or Vivekananda come to the conclusion that all the yogas are equally placed in a pedestal?
That's a very good question. Should I repeat the question because maybe the people in the online may not be able to? So you said Shankara, for instance, put Jnana Yoga above the other yogas. So on what basis did Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda teach that all the different yogas are on an equal footing? So I have different answers for the two cases. So with regard to Ramakrishna, he actually practiced both Bhakti Yoga and Jnana Yoga. So he practiced Advaita Vedanta under Totapuri. He practiced Bhakti Yoga under a number of different gurus. Bhairavi Brahmani, and then Kenaram Bhatta. I mean, so he practiced Shaktism and Vaishnavism and Christianity and Islam. And he realized that all of these yogas are equally capable of taking us to the goal of salvation because he attained God realization through all of these different paths. So it's on an experiential basis for Sri Ramakrishna. For Swamiji, the basic idea is, this is a little bit more complicated. I discuss this in more detail in the second chapter of my new book. But what he says is, we already have the knowledge of God and the knowledge of our Atman in our own souls. The problem is ignorance. And we're ignorant because of the impurities of our mind. And so the main aim of all of these yogas is to remove these impurities from our hearts and minds. And the moment that we become pure, that knowledge which is already within us manifests. We don't need anything other than, so it's like all of these yogas are just, they're like scrubbing away the impurities from. Sri Ramakrishna will use a nice example of God, likening God to a magnet, a giant magnet of infinite attractive power. And our souls as needles. The needle is naturally going to be attracted to the magnet, but why don't we feel that attraction? Because of the mud of impurities, which is caked over that needle. All of these yogas, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, each one of these has the same aim. What is the aim? To remove that mud, to clean away the mud of impurities. The moment that's cleaned away, the needle will feel naturally attracted to the magnet. It'll jump right to the magnet. So that's the basic mechanism, that's the basic logic, all four yogas on an equal footing. Thank you. It's an excellent question.
Is that something related to the nature of one's person related to the yoga? Like one person has particular nature, is more tend to go to bhakti, but like, is it something related to person?
Yeah, that's another way of answering the same question, which is that, so, you know, we each have, the human personality has different aspects. It has an intellectual aspect, an emotional aspect, a dynamic aspect, and a more meditative aspect. And so each of these yogas also corresponds to these different aspects of the human personality. And it's very difficult to argue that one human faculty is higher than another, right? The heart is better than the head is higher, these, you know. So it's better to say that, you know, these are all very potent resources within the human personality, and each of them is valuable from a spiritual standpoint. Yeah, thank you.
Just to elaborate or expand on what you said, isn't it something similar that Bhagavad Gita also preaches? First, it talks about the different types of yoga, and then in the last few chapters, it says that based on one's inclination and based on one's like, he or she can do what makes him do better, and what kind of yoga he wants.
Yeah, do you have a particular shloka in mind?
Where Bhagavan Shri Krishna explains like how different kinds of yoga is suited to different kinds of profession and different kinds.
Yeah. Okay, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, sure. So he's asking, doesn't the Bhagavad Gita also say something similar to what Swamiji is saying? Toward the end of the Bhagavad Gita, I think you're thinking of chapter 18, where it describes, it's in the terms of the caste system, but here the caste system is not a hereditary caste system. It's based on guna and karma. So your innate qualities and, you know, your behavior and how you act in the world. And on that basis, it classifies human beings into the 4 different categories. And the first category is the Brahmana. And the Brahmana here is not, as I said, it's not hereditary Brahmins, but the idea is people who are naturally self-controlled, self-restrained, who have a natural purity and devotion toward God, those kinds of things, and who don't try to injure other creatures. And the Kshatriyas, so it goes on like this. So yeah, I think that's nice, exactly. And that part of what Vivekananda was trying to bring our attention to is that if you go back to the original Vedantic scriptures, the Upanishads especially, and the Bhagavad Gita, and also sometimes he mentioned the Brahma Sutra, what you'll find is that they're very, very broad, and they're always trying to harmonize, especially Bhagavad Gita. And he said, Swamiji often said that the Bhagavad Gita is the best commentary on the Upanishads that has ever been in existence, basically. And he said, we should not make the mistake of relying on the sectarian commentators for interpreting our Vedantic scriptures. He warned us against relying on either Shankara's commentaries or Ramanuja's commentaries or Madhva's commentaries. He said, we should try to reinterpret these original Vedantic scriptures in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, because he was a maximally harmonious human being, maximally broad. And by using Sri Ramakrishna as a lens, we can tap into, we can identify the original harmonizing impulse of the Vedantic scriptures themselves, which have been occluded over the centuries by all these sectarian commentaries, which have, they've been, these sectarian acharyas have been fighting with each other for centuries, making fun of each other and calling each other names. So it's what he's saying is, if we go back to the original scriptures, we'll find that they're not at all sectarian. And they embrace all four yogas, even more yogas, all leading to the same goal. Thank you.
Yeah, all right.
Yes, Mother.
So I go into a Christian church. I sit. At that moment, I forget all about how my own guru has instructed me about meditation, the mantra, and think in terms of the Nazarene.
I don't think so. I don't think it's an either or. Oh, but go ahead. Yeah, please.
Go on.
Okay. So
and so with a mosque.
Right.
When I go into a mosque,
Yeah.
am I then trying to become
Yeah.
a devout follower of the Prophet?
Right.
I'm meditating on his teachings,
Yeah.
forgetting all about what I do when it's home in my private meditation. Is that what Swami meant or not?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. So Swami Triparanji asked a very interesting question, because I quoted Swamiji at the very end of my lecture, saying basically that I shall go into the Christian church and kneel with the Christians. I shall go to the mosque and pray with the Muslims. I shall go into the Buddhistic temple, etc., etc. And he's saying, well, how does that work in practice? Does it mean that the instructions given to me by my Hindu guru, that I should suddenly, when I enter a church, I should stop practicing those instructions and forget about Hindu gods and just think about Christ? And the same thing with mosques and so on. I don't think that's what he had in mind. And I think what's important is to keep in mind those 5 principles of Vedanta that I explained in the lecture. And the first principle especially, there's one divine reality. So he's teaching Advaita in that sense, which is that there's only one God. So it's not polytheism. There's one God, but that one God manifests in different forms and aspects to different people. So that one God manifests as Allah to Muslims. That same God manifests as God the Father or as Christ or as Mary to Christians. That same God manifests as Krishna or Kali or Shiva to different Hindu religious practitioners.
Yeah, but
that's the same idea. Yeah.
Want to meditate on the form of Christ.
You still can.
That was the same as my own.
Exactly.
Ideal.
Yeah. I think that's the way that he was thinking. Exactly. Is that you can relish, you can embrace the sheer infinitude of God by going into the Christian church and saying that Sri Ramakrishna or that Krishna or that Allah that I'm worshiping is Christ in a different form. And let me worship the unique avatar of Christ, who came, and was crucified and, and who taught these sublime teachings. And then you can also try to incorporate those teachings in your own.
My own idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the way I'd see it. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, any online questions? You can check, yeah.
But you have to repeat it.
That's fine. Please go ahead and tell me, and then I can.
One Manish is asking, is Dvaita experience of Mother Kali or Sri Krishna same as Advaita experience and the experience of Atman?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Is the
Dvaita experience?
Well, okay, I'll say it loudly. So, is the Dvaita experience of Mother Kali or Sri Krishna the same as the Advaita experience and the experience of the Atman? So this is a good question, and I think there's a common misunderstanding about our tradition. By our tradition, I mean the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. Some people seem to think that our tradition teaches that all experiences of God are the same. And I think that's a serious misunderstanding. When Sri Ramakrishna realized Kali, and when he had that Advaita state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, these were not the same experiences. It's very obvious that they were not the same. He explained them very differently, in fact. In the Kathamrita, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, he distinguished 2 kinds of Samadhi. The first kind he called Bhava Samadhi, or Chetana Samadhi, and the second he called Jada Samadhi, or Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And he said Bhava Samadhi is a spiritual experience of the personal God. And Jada Samadhi or Nirvikalpa Samadhi is the Advaitic realization of your nature as non-dual pure consciousness. And he said that phenomenologically, they're completely different experiences. But philosophically or ontologically, we can say, they are just different realizations of the same infinite divine reality. So that's we should distinguish the phenomenological diversity of different spiritual experiences from the ontological identity of the different ultimates, whether we call it Brahman or God or Allah or, Shiva. I hope that answers the question.
The goal is this, we've reached there.
Yeah. Well, look.
Seeing your Isha or seeing something without form. We've got there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's just, you can get up to the peak of a mountain through different paths. Imagine there are 4 or 100 paths. Each one will take you to the same goal. Okay, that may not be a perfect metaphor. A better one would be the blind man and the elephant, because each person is touching a different part of the elephant. Each one is different, right? So the tail feels differently from the trunk or the stomach, right? But they're all touching different parts of the elephant. So I think that would be probably the best analogy, which is the one that Ramakrishna used, right? They're phenomenologically different experiences, but they're experiences of one and the same divine reality. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. I was reading Swamiji, and Swamiji was saying that the ancient seers and saints who thought great, profound ideas, even after shedding the body, the ideas live on. And whenever they get an instrument which is collaborated to that ideas flow. So Swami Vivekananda visited here. In gross form, he is not here. But in subtle form, I believe he again spoke.
That's very generous of you, too generous.
And he also didn't speak his own voice. This voice which you spoke was Vivekananda's, but Vivekananda's voice also, I believe, comes from, again, a Yoga Shastra, Bhagavad Gita. And at the end, where they say that Itite Jnanam Akhyatam Vyad Vyatram Vimarsheta Sheshena Yathet Shasit. I've told you what are the paths. You follow any or all, but you think and you decide. There is no compulsion and no necessity, whichever suits your nature, whichever suits you. But it is coming from a Punya Purusha, a complete human, Krishna. So he has all those things. So if you want to be ideal, follow all. If you can follow one, follow one. If you can follow two, follow two. So I think this was the idea which came from you. We are so grateful that you gave this talk, and we all got an opportunity to hear it from you. And of course, at this place, thanks to the family and their generous support. And as Maharaj said, follow everything, but let it not be the khichdi. But at least we can have khichdi. So after this, please join us for a khichdi at 145 Woodstock Road. And thank you so much.
We'll end with the mantra. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ram.